Hello and welcome to this episode of Math with Martinez. We are in our series in Algebra 2 on square root functions and equations. This is Unit 6. And in this video, we are looking at writing the inverse of a function using notation such as f inverse of x. And that is exactly where I'm going to jump in here in this video. The notation. The inverse of a function, if that function is called f of x, would be written as f and then a little -1 in the exponent or superscript area, and then the input of x. And the way that we read that is the inverse of x. This would be read as f inverse of x. So that's exactly how you will notate the inverse of a function. Of course, if the function would have been like a g, then it would have been g inverse of x. Or if it was an h, you would use an h corresponding with the function letter. So how do we find the inverse? Well, to recap, this is not a brand new procedure, but these are our steps that we're going to be taking. First, you will change it from this function notation to just writing it using the variable y. And then you're going to interchange x with y, so you'll be switching your variables. You'll solve for y, and then make sure that you write the inverse using the notation that we saw above. So let's do some examples together. I'll keep these steps visible so we can reference them as we go. So we'll begin with step number 1, replacing f of x with y. Let's do that in red, like I've highlighted. So we would write it as follows. There we go. Then our next step is going to be to interchange x with y, and that looks like taking, instead of y, we write x, and instead of x, we write the variable y. After that, we're going to want to solve for y, and here's how we will do that. You always want to undo first either addition and subtraction. So because we're adding 3, the first step would be to subtract 3 on each side. That gives me x minus 3 equals the square root of y minus 2. That would be your first step when you're solving for y. Why don't we make that little note to ourselves right here? First, undo either adding or subtracting. And specifically, the place where you would undo the adding or subtracting is outside or after your square root if you're working with a square root function. Then you would want to look and see, if possible, if there would have been any multiplying or dividing outside the radical, you would do that next. But we actually don't have any of that. But I will show you that here in an example that follows. So if we don't have anything else either in front or after our radical, like is the case here, then what we want to do is undo. Undo the square root by taking the square, by taking and squaring each side. So I'm going to go ahead and take like so, and just like that. That is going to be the opposite operation of taking the square root. So that's going to cancel out on that side. My square root, it undoes it. And so I'm left with just what is inside the radical, that y minus 2. The radicand is all that is left. And you can leave this squared. There's no need to try and take that binomial and expand it out. You can leave it just like this in the form where it's factored like that. Then the last step is to go ahead and after you've squared each side, you want to make sure that you undo either that adding or subtracting or multiplying and dividing. So then we would want to undo adding or subtracting 2y. And so because we are subtracting, we'll want to add 2 on each side. That will give me that binomial squared, then plus the 2. And now my y is all by itself. So we have done the process of solving for y. Now we can go ahead and write y as f inverse of x. So here's my final answer. It would be to write it as f inverse of x. And then the function rule, which is x minus 3, that quantity is squared, and then adding 2. There we go. That would be the inverse of that function f. So let's look at another one. Let's look at b. First thing, what are we going to want to do? The very first step, replace f of x with y. So it will look like this. Then we want to interchange x with y. And next, solve for y. So what's going to be our first step in solving for y in that third step, that green step? Yeah, because we're subtracting 2. The first thing is undoing adding or subtracting. The adding or subtracting after the radical. We'll want to do the opposite operation. Perfect. Okay, I don't have any multiplying or dividing in front of my radical, so I'm going to go ahead and go on to the next step, which is to undo my radical by squaring each side. And that will leave me with just the expression that was in the radical and my other side squared. Last step, what do I need to do to get y by itself? Yep, undo adding by subtracting. There we go. So when we write this using that function notation, it would look like this. We would have f inverse of x equals that x plus 2 squared and then minus 4. There you go. All right, let's see about another couple examples here. These are going to ask us to do a little bit more work in order to solve, and so I want to show you guys how we'll do that. But again, they start the same. That red step, replace f of x with y. Then interchange the x and y. All right, now we're on to that step where we are solving for y. So the first thing you want to undo is, like we see here, Step number 1, undo adding or subtracting after a radical. We do have something after our radical being added, so I'll go ahead and subtract that amount. But notice now, I still have something in front of my radical. That's different from what we had seen previously. If we have something in front of our radical, multiplying, like we have this 2, then we need to undo that by dividing by 2. Dividing by 2. So what's that going to be? We will have our x divided by 2, or you could say 1/2 x. And then when you subtract the -2 by the 2, that's going to be a -1. And then the other side now is just our square root. All right. Good, good. You could also write this, if you wanted to, you could write this as x over 2, just like that. But I kind of like to put the coefficient out front. All right. So now that we've done that, we want to go ahead and undo our radical by taking each side and squaring it. So I'm taking my square root and squaring it so that all I'm left with is the expression that was my radicand. There we go. And then finally, you want to undo any adding or subtracting to the y. We have addition, so we must subtract. And that comes after our binomial that is squared. So let's go ahead and write that. What will that be? That would be written as f inverse of x equals that binomial squared and then minus the 1. There you go. We've got just one more. Why don't you guys pause the video and try it on your own. See if you can solve this one. Or I should say, not solve, but go through the steps, including that solving process. That's kind of the longer portion, so that you can find that inverse function. Go ahead and try that now. All right, so you should have first rewritten and then swapped your variables. Then begun the process of solving by first undoing the subtracting by adding the 4. And then in front, I have this 1/2. 1/2 is multiplying, so I'm technically dividing by 1/2. But instead of dividing by fractions, remember, instead of dividing by fractions, we always want to multiply by their reciprocals. That's to multiply by a 2/1. So what's that going to give us? 2x plus 8 when you distribute. And on the other side, that is going to actually cancel so that we're left with just the radical and the radicand. Then we will take and square each side. And that cancels our radical so that we're left with just that radicand. And our final step, adding 3. So we would have that binomial squared plus the 3 is what y is equal to. So we write that inverse function f inverse of x is going to be 2x x plus 8, that is squared, and add 3 to it. There you go, guys. That is the process of finding the inverse of a square root function. If you had any questions about these procedures, please take a moment and share those now. And until next time, stay fired up.